When the CEO laughed at the single dad for buying a $100 wreck, she had no idea she was looking at a $5 million piece of history. The auction yard sat on the edge of Fort Worth beneath a hot Texas afternoon sun. Rows of forgotten vehicles stretched across cracked pavement. Rusted pickup trucks, abandoned sedans, damaged project cars. Most of them would never return to the road. Buyers wandered between the rows carrying clipboards and bottles of water while auctioneers prepared for the final sales of the day. It was not the kind of place where fortunes were usually made. Garrett Cole knew that, which was exactly why he liked it. At 43 years old, Garrett had spent most of his life around old machines. The smell of oil, metal, and dust felt more familiar than expensive restaurants or executive offices ever could. His jeans were faded. His work boots carried years of use. Nothing about him attracted attention. That suited him perfectly. Beside him walked his 11-year-old daughter, Sophie. She carried a notebook and a bottle of lemonade while trying to avoid stepping into puddles left behind by an earlier rainstorm. "Dad," she said, "please tell me we are not buying another disaster." Garrett smiled. "That depends." Sophie groaned dramatically. "You always say that." "Because it is true." She pointed toward a rusted station wagon missing 2 hubcaps. "That looks like a disaster." Garrett laughed. "That one definitely is." They continued walking through the rows of vehicles while bidders examined inventory. Some looked for parts. Others looked for restoration projects. Most looked for bargains. Garrett looked for stories. Every old vehicle carried one. Sometimes the story mattered more than the car itself. Near the far end of the auction yard, a crowd gathered around a black luxury SUV. Cameras appeared. Assistants moved quickly. Conversations changed tone. The arrival attracted attention immediately. Sophie noticed first. "That looks important." Garrett followed her gaze. Standing near the SUV was Rebecca Sterling, CEO of Sterling Automotive Group. 37 years old. Successful. Wealthy. Frequently featured in business magazines. Her company owned dealerships, restoration facilities, and automotive investment ventures across several states. People noticed when she entered a room. Rebecca walked confidently through the auction yard surrounded by advisors discussing inventory values and acquisition opportunities. She barely glanced at most vehicles. Then Garrett stopped in front of a rust-covered coupe sitting alone near the back fence. The car looked terrible. Paint almost gone. Tires flat. Dust covering every surface. Even the auction staff seemed to have forgotten it existed. Sophie looked at the vehicle and sighed. "Oh no." Garrett smiled. "What?" "That face." "What face?" "The face you make when you find something weird." Garrett crouched beside the car. Sunlight reflected faintly from a section of metal hidden beneath years of neglect. He studied it quietly. Then he walked around the vehicle once. Then twice. Sophie crossed her arms. "Dad." Garrett nodded slowly. "Interesting. That is never a good sign." Nearby, bidding began. Several vehicles sold quickly. Others failed to attract interest. Eventually, the neglected coupe reached the auction block. The auctioneer barely sounded enthusiastic. "Starting at $100. Silence followed. Nobody raised a paddle. The car looked worthless. The crowd moved on mentally before the auction even started. $100. Still nothing. Garrett raised his hand. 100. The auctioneer nodded. $100. No competition followed. No excitement. No interest. 3 seconds later, the car belonged to Garrett Cole. Sophie closed her eyes. "We bought it. Looks like it. It does not even run." "Probably not." Rebecca Sterling happened to overhear the conversation while walking nearby. She looked toward the rusted coupe and then toward Garrett. One of her advisors laughed quietly. Another shook his head. Rebecca smiled. "You paid $100 for that." Garrett looked up. "Yes." "Why?" The question drew attention from several people standing nearby. Garrett glanced back toward the car. Then he smiled. It seemed worth it. Laughter spread through the group almost immediately. One advisor pointed toward the vehicle. "That thing belongs in a scrapyard." Another nodded. "You bought a $100 problem." Rebecca folded her arms. "Well, at least you did not overpay." More laughter followed. Sophie heard every word. Garrett did too. Yet his expression never changed. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the auction yard. Dust drifted through the warm Texas air. Around him, people continued laughing at the old wreck nobody wanted. Garrett simply looked at the car one more time. Then at a tiny detail hidden beneath years of rust and neglect. A detail nobody else noticed. And for the first time all afternoon, he smiled. The drive home took nearly an hour. The old coupe sat on a trailer behind Garrett Cole's pickup truck while Sophie watched it through the rear window, as though hoping it might magically improve. It did not. Every mile seemed to reveal another flaw. Rust covered entire sections of the body. The paint had almost completely disappeared. One headlight hung slightly crooked. To anyone passing on the highway, it looked exactly like what Rebecca Sterling called it. $100 problem. You know, Sophie said finally, people usually buy cars because they are good. Garrett smiled without taking his eyes off the road. That is one strategy. And this is not that strategy. Apparently not. Sophie shook her head. I still think you are hiding something. Garrett laughed softly. She knew him too well. By the time they reached home, the sun had begun dropping toward the horizon. Their small workshop sat behind a modest house outside Fort Worth. Nothing about the place looked impressive. A weathered garage, a few old tool cabinets, shelves filled with parts and manuals collected over decades. Yet for Garrett, it felt perfect. It was honest. He carefully backed the trailer into the driveway, while Sophie climbed out and stared at the car again. It somehow looks worse here. Garrett nodded. That happens. You say that about everything. Only the things that happen. Sophie rolled her eyes. Inside the workshop, Garrett switched on the overhead lights and slowly walked around the vehicle. His attention remained fixed on one particular area near the rear quarter panel. The same area he studied at the auction. The same area nobody else noticed. Sophie stood beside him holding a flashlight. What are you looking for? Garrett paused. Then he smiled. A story. That is not an answer. It is the only one I have right now. The truth was more complicated. Years earlier, before becoming a single father, before opening a small repair shop, Garrett spent much of his career around racing programs and development projects. He understood vehicle history the way some people understood family genealogy. Tiny details mattered. Manufacturing marks, prototype numbers, component variations. Sometimes one small detail changed everything. Most people saw old cars. Garrett saw evidence. Later that evening, after dinner, he returned to the workshop alone. Sophie had homework. The house grew quiet. Outside, crickets filled the Texas night air. Inside, the smell of old metal and machine oil surrounded him. He carefully cleaned dirt from a small section of the vehicle. Then another. Then another. Hours passed. Midnight arrived. Garrett never noticed. Finally, his hand stopped moving. There it was. Exactly where he hoped it would be. Not proof. Not yet. But enough to make his pulse quicken. He stared at the detail for several seconds before reaching for an old reference book stored on a nearby shelf. The pages were worn from years of use. He flipped through photographs and production records, then compared them again. The possibility seemed almost ridiculous, which was exactly why nobody else saw it. The next morning, Sophie found him asleep in a chair beside the car. Dad. No response. Dad. Still nothing. Dad. You are drooling on automotive history. Garrett opened one eye immediately. What? Sophie laughed. You heard that part. He sat up and rubbed his face. The reference book still rested on his lap. Notes covered the workbench. Did you figure it out? She asked. Garrett considered the question carefully. Maybe. Sophie groaned. There is that word again. He smiled. It is an important word. She looked toward the coupe. Is it valuable? Garrett stood and stretched. Potentially. How valuable? He shook his head. Too early to know. Sophie followed him around the vehicle while he continued documenting details. For the next several hours, Garrett made phone calls, sent photographs, requested information from people he trusted. Not social media, not public forums. Real experts. The kind of people who cared more about accuracy than attention. Across town, Rebecca Sterling attended a business luncheon surrounded by investors and executives. During a conversation about recent acquisitions, someone mentioned the auction. Rebecca laughed immediately. The best purchase of the day was still that $100 wreck. The table laughed with her. Who bought it? An investor asked. Rebecca smiled. A man who clearly enjoys bad decisions. More laughter followed. Meanwhile, Garrett continued working quietly inside his workshop. He never defended himself. Never explained anything. Never contacted Rebecca. The opinions of strangers did not matter. Facts did. By late afternoon, his phone finally rang. Garrett looked at the number and immediately stood. The caller was someone he had been hoping to hear from. Someone whose opinion carried weight throughout the racing world. Sophie noticed his expression instantly. That looks important. Garrett answered the phone. Then he listened. And for the first time since purchasing the forgotten coupe, his smile disappeared completely. Not because the news was bad, because it was far bigger than he expected. Garrett lowered the phone slowly and stared at the old coupe sitting beneath the workshop lights. For several seconds, he did not speak. He did not move. The silence alone told Sophie everything she needed to know. She immediately put down her notebook and stood. Dad, Garrett continued looking at the car. Yeah, that was not a normal phone call. He smiled faintly. No. Sophie folded her arms. Good news. Garrett considered the question carefully. Potentially. Sophie groaned dramatically. You are doing it again. Doing what? Answering without answering. Garrett laughed softly. The truth was difficult to explain because he still struggled to believe it himself. The man who called was one of the most respected historians in American motorsports. Someone who spent decades researching lost prototypes, special development cars, and forgotten racing programs. He almost never sounded excited. Yet during the call, excitement filled every word. That alone meant something. Garrett walked back toward the coupe and pointed his flashlight at the small detail hidden beneath years of grime. The stamped marking looked insignificant. Most people would never notice it. Yet it matched records connected to a vehicle many collectors believe had disappeared forever. Sophie leaned closer. That tiny thing. Garrett nodded. Sometimes tiny things matter. That tiny. Especially that tiny. The rest of the afternoon disappeared inside a blur of research, photographs, and phone calls. Garrett contacted additional experts. More records were requested. More images were sent. Every response pushed the possibility further from unlikely and closer to real. By evening, he finally sat down at the kitchen table exhausted. Sophie placed a plate of food in front of him. You forgot dinner again. Garrett looked up. Did I? Twice this week. He smiled. That sounds familiar. Across town, Rebecca Sterling attended a charity event hosted by several automotive executives. Conversations flowed easily. Investments, acquisitions, industry trends. During one discussion, someone mentioned the auction again. Did you buy anything interesting? A collector asked. Rebecca shook her head. Nothing worth talking about. Another executive laughed. What about that old coupe? Rebecca smiled immediately. The $100 disaster? The group laughed. That one. Rebecca took a sip of coffee. Trust me, the only value in that car is the trailer carrying it. More laughter followed. Nobody questioned the statement. Why would they? On paper, the car appeared worthless. Meanwhile, several miles away, Garrett's phone continued ringing. The first expert told him the markings were rare. The second called them extraordinary. The third requested additional photographs immediately. By midnight, one conclusion appeared consistently. The car deserved closer examination. Much closer. The next morning, Garrett opened the workshop before sunrise. Sophie arrived carrying 2 cups of coffee. One for him, one for herself. I know I am 11, she said. But this feels like a coffee emergency. Garrett laughed. Fair assessment. They spent the morning carefully cleaning specific areas of the vehicle. Not restoring, not repairing, simply uncovering information. Piece by piece, more evidence appeared. Original components. Unique manufacturing characteristics. Tiny details connected to a chapter of racing history almost nobody remembered. Around noon, another call arrived. Garrett answered immediately. This time, he listened for nearly 10 minutes without interrupting. When the conversation ended, Sophie looked at him expectantly. Well, Garrett sat down slowly. Someone wants to visit. Who? A collector. Sophie narrowed her eyes. That is not the whole answer. Garrett smiled. No. Who? Someone famous. Sophie nearly dropped her coffee. How famous? Garrett hesitated. Then he answered honestly. Very. The workshop suddenly felt much smaller. Outside, warm Texas sunlight spilled across the driveway. Inside, the forgotten coupe sat quietly beneath the lights as though unaware of the attention it was attracting. The visitor planned to arrive in 3 days. Until then, Garrett intended to keep working exactly as before. No announcements. No interviews. No social media posts. Just patience. Across the state, however, rumors had already started spreading through collector circles. Messages moved between enthusiasts. Photographs circulated quietly. Questions multiplied. One particular image eventually reached the desk of a retired racing legend whose name still carried enormous weight throughout American motorsports. The moment he saw the photograph, he canceled the meeting. Then he made a phone call. Then another. By sunset, arrangements were already being made. Back in his workshop, Garrett switched off the lights and prepared to go inside for dinner. Before leaving, he glanced one more time at the old coupe. 5 days earlier, people laughed when he bought it. 3 days from now, one of the most recognizable names in racing history would be standing inside his workshop asking to see it. The next 3 days passed more slowly than Garrett Cole expected. Not because he lacked patience, because every few hours another phone call arrived. Historians, collectors, researchers, people who normally ignored rumors suddenly wanted information. The old coupe remained exactly where it sat in the workshop, yet somehow the world around it had started changing. Sophie noticed immediately. "You have become popular." Garrett looked up from a notebook filled with reference numbers and production records. "That sounds dangerous." "Your phone has not stopped ringing." "That is true." Sophie smiled. "I liked it better when nobody called." Garrett laughed softly. "So did I." Despite the growing attention, he refused to make assumptions. Evidence mattered. Facts mattered. Excitement did not. Every spare moment was spent verifying details. Production codes, historical records, racing archives. The more he learned, the more extraordinary the possibility became. Yet one question remained unanswered. If the car was truly what several experts suspected, why had it disappeared for so many years? Early Friday morning, the answer finally began emerging. A retired historian sent over several documents recovered from old racing records. Garrett studied them quietly while Sophie sat nearby eating cereal. The paperwork described a development vehicle connected to a legendary racing program from decades earlier. A prototype, a one-of-one engineering project. Lost, forgotten, presumed destroyed. Garrett looked toward the coupe sitting beneath the workshop lights. Then back at the records. Then at the coupe again. Sophie noticed his expression immediately. "That bad?" Garrett shook his head. "No." "Good." He hesitated. "Maybe." Sophie dropped her spoon onto the table. "Dad." "All right." Garrett smiled. "Very good." The workshop suddenly felt much smaller. Later that afternoon, another unexpected visitor arrived. This time it was not a collector. It was a journalist. Then another. Word continued spreading through automotive circles faster than Garrett anticipated. By sunset, several online forums were already discussing the possibility. Most people remained skeptical. A few seemed excited. Nobody knew the truth yet. Meanwhile, Rebecca Sterling sat inside her corporate office reviewing dealership acquisition reports when an assistant walked in carrying a tablet. "You should see this." Rebecca glanced up. "What?" The assistant placed the tablet on her desk. Several automotive websites displayed the same story. Rumors surrounding a forgotten coupe purchased at a local auction. Rebecca laughed immediately. "Not that car again." Her assistant shrugged. "Apparently people think it is special." Rebecca looked at the grainy photographs and shook her head. "People think a lot of things." Yet even as she dismissed the story, curiosity lingered. Something about Garrett's confidence at the auction kept returning to her memory. Most people who made bad purchases looked uncertain afterward. Garrett never had. Saturday morning arrived bright and clear. Sophie woke before sunrise. She ran into the workshop while still carrying a blanket around her shoulders. "Are they here yet?" Garrett looked up from a workbench. "No." "What time?" 10 o'clock. Sophie checked a wall clock. "That is forever." Garrett smiled. "Not quite." At exactly 10 o'clock, a black SUV turned into the driveway. Then another. Then another. Several vehicles followed behind them. The procession looked completely out of place in front of the small workshop. Sophie immediately rushed to the window. "That has to be them." Garrett nodded slowly. "Looks like it." The vehicles stopped. Doors opened. Several people stepped out carrying cameras, folders, and equipment. Then one final figure emerged from the last SUV. The moment Garrett saw him, he understood why everyone else seemed so nervous. Even Sophie recognized the face. "No way." Garrett remained silent. Because standing in front of the workshop was a man whose name appeared in racing history books. A man whose achievements transformed American motorsports. A man collectors, engineers, and enthusiasts still talked about decades later. The racing legend himself had arrived. The group entered the workshop quietly. Nobody rushed toward the car. Nobody made dramatic announcements. The legend simply walked around the coupe once. then twice, then a third time. Every person in the room watched carefully. The silence felt almost sacred. Finally, the man stopped beside the rear quarter panel and pointed toward the tiny detail Garrett discovered days earlier. That is it. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The legend looked directly at Garrett. Then he smiled. Not the smile of someone examining an old car. The smile of someone finding a lost piece of history. And in that moment, Garrett realized the next few minutes were going to change everything. The workshop remained completely silent. Nobody wanted to interrupt the moment. The racing legend continued examining the coupe while photographers, historians, and collectors watched from a respectful distance. Dust floated through beams of sunlight entering from the open garage door. The old car sat motionless beneath the lights, looking no different than it had 5 days earlier. Yet everything about it felt different now. The legend slowly ran his hand along the weathered body panel and stopped beside the marking Garrett discovered. Then he looked toward the group behind him. Do you know how many people have searched for this car? Nobody answered. The question seemed rhetorical. For over 30 years, he continued, people believed it was gone forever. Sophie glanced toward her father. Garrett remained completely still. The legend smiled faintly. Some thought it was destroyed. Others believed it had been dismantled. He looked back at the coupe. Turns out it was sitting in an auction yard waiting for someone to notice it. Several historians exchanged looks. Cameras clicked. The atmosphere inside the workshop felt almost surreal. One collector stepped forward cautiously. You are certain? The legend laughed softly. As certain as I can be without opening a museum exhibit. A few people smiled. Then his expression became serious again. This is one of the most important lost development vehicles in American racing history. The words settled heavily across the room. Sophie's eyes widened. Garrett simply listened. He had spent 5 days verifying possibilities. Hearing them confirmed aloud still felt unreal. The legend continued explaining. Decades earlier, the coupe served as part of an experimental racing program that influenced future competition vehicles. Unique engineering changes separated it from production models. Most records disappeared. The vehicle itself vanished. Until now. Every explanation increased the tension inside the room. Every detail added significance. One photographer lowered his camera and whispered, "Unbelievable." Another nodded. Nobody seemed interested in the rust anymore. Nobody cared about faded paint. The old wreck everyone laughed at was becoming something else entirely. Hours passed quickly. Experts documented markings, verified components, compared records. By late afternoon, nobody doubted the conclusion. The forgotten coupe was authentic. The discovery spread immediately. Articles appeared online within hours. Automotive forums exploded with discussion. Collectors started making calls. Enthusiasts shared photographs. By evening, the story had reached every major corner of the racing community. Across town, Rebecca Sterling sat inside a restaurant during a business dinner when her phone began vibrating repeatedly. At first she ignored it. Then another message arrived. Then another. Finally she glanced at the screen. Several headlines appeared. Her smile disappeared instantly. She opened the first article. Then the second. Then a third. Everyone told the same story. The $100 wreck from the auction was not a wreck at all. Rebecca stared at the screen in disbelief. Around the table, several executives noticed the change in her expression. Everything okay? Someone asked. Rebecca looked up slowly. Apparently not. Back at the workshop, another surprise arrived before sunset. The racing legend requested a private conversation with Garrett. They stepped outside while Sophie remained inside listening to excited historians. The evening air felt warm. Crickets had already begun singing from nearby fields. The legend leaned against his SUV and smiled. You knew something was unusual. Garrett nodded. I suspected. Most people would have announced it immediately. Most people would have been guessing. The legend laughed. Fair answer. For a moment, both men looked toward the workshop where the coupe sat surrounded by experts. Then the legend became serious. I would like the opportunity to buy it. Garrett remained silent. He expected the conversation eventually. Just not so soon. I am listening. The legend named a number. Garrett did not react immediately. Not because the amount failed to impress him. Because it was already far beyond anything he imagined. Before he could answer, the legend raised a hand. That is my opening offer. Garrett blinked. Opening. The legend smiled. I do not think you understand what you found. Inside the workshop, Sophie watched through the window. She could not hear the conversation. Yet she recognized one thing immediately: the expression on her father's face. It was the same expression he wore the day he bought the car. The same expression he wore when everyone laughed. Calm, thoughtful, certain. 5 days earlier, people mocked a single father for spending $100 on a forgotten piece of metal. Now one of the most respected names in racing history was standing in his driveway, trying to buy it. And the number being discussed was about to leave everyone speechless. The number hung in the air between them. Garrett Cole did not respond immediately. The racing legend seemed perfectly comfortable waiting. Years of negotiations taught him patience. Great discoveries often required it. The evening sun cast long shadows across the driveway while the sounds of excited conversations drifted from inside the workshop. Finally, Garrett smiled slightly. That is a very large number. The legend laughed. It is not large enough. Garrett raised an eyebrow. Not large enough. Not if the documentation verifies what I think it will. For the first time all week, Garrett looked genuinely surprised. The legend folded his arms and glanced toward the workshop. Most people are focusing on the car. What should they be focusing on? What the car represents. The answer stayed with Garrett long after the conversation ended. Inside, historians continued examining records and components. Every hour seemed to uncover something new. The story attached to the coupe kept growing. What originally appeared to be an unusual prototype now looked like a missing piece of American racing history. The next morning, national automotive publications began covering the discovery. Interviews were requested. Experts debated the significance. Collectors discussed possible valuations. The attention felt overwhelming. Garrett avoided most of it. Sophie found the situation far more entertaining. You are famous now. Garrett nearly dropped a wrench. No. Yes. Definitely not. Sophie pointed toward a laptop displaying another article. The internet disagrees. Garrett laughed despite himself. The workshop phone rang again. Then again. Then again. One collector offered a substantial amount of money without even seeing the vehicle in person. Another requested an immediate meeting. A third offered to fly in from California. Garrett declined every proposal. Not because he lacked interest. Because the process was not finished. Facts still mattered more than excitement. Across town, Rebecca Sterling followed the story more closely than she admitted. At first it was curiosity, then concern, then disbelief. Every new article seemed more unbelievable than the last. She remembered standing in the auction yard laughing at the purchase. She remembered the rust, the faded paint, the broken trim. Most of all, she remembered Garrett smiling while everyone else laughed. The memory bothered her. A lot. One afternoon, Rebecca finally drove to the workshop herself. No assistants. No executives. No cameras. Just curiosity. She parked outside and stepped out slowly. The scene surprised her immediately. Several vehicles lined the driveway. Historians moved between buildings carrying documents. Photographers took pictures. Collectors stood in small groups discussing details. The workshop looked more like a museum than a repair shop. Sophie spotted her first. Dad. Garrett looked up from a workbench. What? Sophie pointed toward the driveway. Your favorite CEO is here. Garrett laughed. That does not sound promising. Rebecca approached carefully. The confidence she displayed at the auction seemed noticeably smaller now. Hello. Garrett smiled politely. Hello. Several awkward seconds passed. Neither seemed eager to speak first. Finally, Rebecca looked toward the coupe sitting beneath workshop lights. So. Garrett nodded. So. She laughed softly. This is uncomfortable. A little. Rebecca shook her head. I owe you an apology. Garrett immediately understood. For the auction? For several things. She looked toward the car. Mostly for assuming I knew more than I did. The honesty surprised him. It also impressed him. Admitting mistakes rarely comes easily to successful people. Rebecca continued. You already knew something was special, did not you? Garrett considered the question. I suspected. And you never said anything. I was not sure. Rebecca smiled. I would have told everyone. Garrett laughed. That is probably true. The tension finally eased. For the next hour, Rebecca listened while historians explained what they had discovered. Every new detail made her shake her head. Every document increased the significance. By the end, she understood exactly why the racing legend seemed so interested. As the afternoon faded into evening, the legend returned to the workshop carrying a folder. The atmosphere changed immediately. Conversations stopped. Historians looked up. Collectors stepped closer. Even Sophie sensed something important was happening. The legend placed the folder on a workbench and looked directly at Garrett. The documentation is complete. Silence followed. The workshop became completely still. The legend opened the folder. There is no doubt anymore. Garrett remained calm. Sophie held her breath. Rebecca watched carefully. Then the legend smiled. I would like to officially purchase the vehicle. Garrett nodded. All right. The legend slid a single sheet of paper across the workbench. Everyone looked down at the number printed near the bottom. For a moment, nobody spoke. Not because they did not understand it. Because they did. 5 days earlier, people laughed at a single father for buying a $100 wreck. Now a racing legend had just placed an offer worth $5 million on the table. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The workshop felt completely frozen. The number printed on the page sat beneath the overhead lights like something unreal. $5 million. The racing legend stood quietly beside the workbench. Historians stared at the document. Collectors looked at one another in disbelief. Even Rebecca Sterling seemed unable to find words. Sophie was the first person to break the silence. Dad. Garrett looked at her. Yeah. Is that $5 million? A few people laughed softly. Not because the question sounded silly. Because everyone else wanted to ask the exact same thing. Garrett looked back at the offer. Then nodded. It appears to be. Sophie sat down immediately. I need a minute. The room laughed again. The tension finally loosened. Yet the number remained on the table. Real. Tangible. Extraordinary. The racing legend folded his arms. I told you the first offer was not high enough. Garrett smiled faintly. You did. And I was serious. Several collectors standing nearby looked mildly frustrated. They knew exactly what the offer meant. The vehicle would almost certainly disappear into one of the most respected private collections in the country. Yet nobody seemed willing to challenge the price. Because they understood something important. The legend was not buying a car. He was buying history. News of the offer spread almost immediately. By evening, articles began appearing online. By midnight, automotive websites across the country were discussing the story. Reporters called continuously. Television producers requested interviews. The workshop phone rang so often that Sophie eventually unplugged it. This is getting ridiculous. Garrett laughed. A little. People never cared about us before. The observation lingered longer than she realized. Garrett looked around the workshop. Same walls. Same tools. Same workbench. The attention felt strange because nothing about their lives had changed yet. Except it had. The next morning, a crowd gathered outside the workshop. Enthusiasts. Journalists. Curious neighbors. Everyone wanted to see the famous coupe. Garrett remained polite but cautious. The story no longer belonged only to him. It belonged to history. Several historians arrived early to complete final documentation. The racing legend returned as well. This time he carried additional paperwork. Everything moved toward a conclusion. Around noon, Rebecca Sterling arrived once more. Unlike her previous visit, nobody paid much attention to her arrival. The focus remained entirely on the car. The realization seemed uncomfortable. Not because she wanted attention. Because it reminded her how completely she misunderstood the situation. She found Garrett standing near the workshop entrance reviewing documents. Quite a week. Garrett nodded. That is one way to describe it. Rebecca smiled. I have been trying to think of something smart to say. Any luck? Not really. Garrett laughed. Rebecca looked toward the coupe. You knew before everyone else. Not exactly. Close enough. She shook her head. I looked at that car and saw a $100 mistake. Garrett remained quiet. You looked at it and saw something nobody else could see. The honesty in her voice carried no defensiveness. Only respect. Garrett appreciated that. Around them, reporters continued taking photographs. Historians discussed technical details. The atmosphere felt busy. Yet somehow the conversation remained personal. Can I ask you something? Rebecca said. Garrett nodded. Sure. Why did you never argue with anyone? The question surprised him. At the auction. She glanced down briefly. When people laughed. Garrett thought for a moment. Then he smiled. Because arguing would not change the truth. Rebecca looked toward the coupe. Then back at him. The answer stayed with her. A few hours later, the final paperwork was completed. Cameras documented the moment. Historians signed verification documents. The racing legend officially acquired the vehicle. Yet the transaction itself almost felt secondary. The real story was everything that happened before it. As the crowd slowly dispersed, the legend approached Garrett one final time. "You know," he said, "most people would be celebrating right now." Garrett smiled. "Maybe." The legend laughed. "There is that word." For a moment, both men looked toward the empty space where the coupe had sat. Then the legend extended his hand. "Thank you." Garrett shook it. "For what?" The answer came immediately. "For paying attention when nobody else did." The sun slowly began setting over Texas. Long shadows stretched across the driveway. The excitement of the week finally started fading. Yet one thing remained. The lesson. 5 days earlier, people laughed at a single father for buying a forgotten wreck. Today, nobody was laughing. Because sometimes the most valuable things in the world look worthless to everyone except the one person willing to look closer. The workshop felt strangely quiet the following week. The crowds disappeared. The reporters moved on to other stories. The photographers stopped calling. Even the endless stream of messages finally slowed. For the first time in days, Garrett Cole stood alone inside the garage listening to nothing but the familiar sounds of tools, fans, and distant traffic. The old coupe was gone. The empty space it left behind seemed larger than expected. Sophie noticed it immediately. "It feels weird in here." Garrett glanced toward the vacant corner. "A little. Do you miss it?" He considered the question. "Not exactly." Sophie smiled. "You miss the mystery." Garrett laughed softly. "Maybe. Life should have changed dramatically after the sale. Most people expected that. Neighbors expected it. Journalists expected it. Even distant relatives suddenly seemed interested in reconnecting. Yet very little changed. Garrett still opened the workshop every morning. He still repaired engines. He still drank coffee from the same old mug. He still drove the same pickup truck. The money sat in the bank while he carefully considered what to do with it. One evening, Sophie found him reviewing paperwork at the kitchen table. "You know what normal people would do?" Garrett looked up. "Spend it." "Exactly. That sounds dangerous." Sophie laughed. "You are impossible." The truth was simple. Garrett never cared about becoming rich. What mattered to him was freedom, security, time, the ability to provide opportunities for Sophie that he never had growing up. That mattered far more than headlines. Across town, Rebecca Sterling continued thinking about the auction. Not the money, not the car, the lesson. Every time she remembered laughing at Garrett, she felt uncomfortable. Not because she had been wrong. Everyone is wrong sometimes. Because she had been so certain. Eventually, she decided to visit the workshop again. This time there were no cameras, no crowds, no excitement. Just a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Garrett was rebuilding an engine when she arrived. He looked up and smiled. "Hello." Rebecca smiled back. "You still work?" Garrett laughed. "Most days." She looked around the garage. Nothing appeared different. The same tools, the same shelves, the same modest building. "You really did not change anything." "Should I have?" Rebecca shook her head. "Most people would." Sophie appeared from the office carrying paperwork. "That is what I keep telling him." Rebecca laughed. For the next hour they talked about ordinary things. Not racing history. Not money. Just life. Somewhere during the conversation, Rebecca realized something important. Garrett never saw the car as a lottery ticket. He saw it as a puzzle. A story. A responsibility. That difference explained everything. Several weeks later, a package arrived at the workshop. No return address. No explanation. Inside was a framed photograph. Garrett immediately recognized it. The image showed the moment the racing legend first stood beside the coupe. Historians surrounded the vehicle. Dust floated through the sunlight. Everyone stared at the car. Yet Garrett noticed something else. In the photograph, Sophie stood beside him smiling. Tucked inside the frame was a handwritten note. "Some people find value. Others recognize it. Thank you for saving a piece of history." The signature belonged to the racing legend. Garrett stared at the note for several seconds. Then he hung the photograph on the workshop wall. Not because of the car. Not because of the money. Because it reminded him of something much more important. A few months later, the story faded from public attention. New discoveries appeared. New headlines replaced old ones. Yet in the small Texas town where everything happened, people still talked about it occasionally. They remembered the auction, the laughter, the rusted coupe, the impossible offer. Most of all, they remembered the quiet single father who never argued with anyone. One evening, as the sun set behind the workshop, Sophie sat beside her father watching the golden lights stretch across the parking lot. "Dad." Garrett looked up. "Yeah." "Do you know what my favorite part was?" "What?" Sophie smiled. You knew before everybody else. Garrett laughed softly. Not everybody. Who else knew? She pointed toward herself. Me. For a moment, neither spoke. The warm evening air drifted through the open garage door. Then Garrett smiled. Because in the end, the most valuable thing he found was never hidden inside a forgotten car. It was the quiet confidence that comes from trusting what you know, even when the whole world is laughing. Years later, people still told the story. Not because of the money, not because of the racing legend, not even because of the forgotten coupe. They told it because of what it revealed about human nature. The story became part of local folklore around Fort Worth. New versions appeared every year. Some exaggerated details. Others added things that never happened. Yet the core remained unchanged. A single father saw value where everyone else saw junk. And he trusted his knowledge long enough to let the truth reveal itself. Garrett Cole never tried to become a symbol. He never wanted to be the man people quoted in speeches or business seminars. Yet life rarely asks permission before assigning meaning to a story. One spring morning, several years after the auction, Garrett unlocked the workshop as he always did. The building looked almost identical to the day he purchased the coupe. Same tools, same workbenches, same smell of oil and metal. The framed photograph from the racing legend still hung on the wall. Customers still arrived with ordinary problems. Engines still needed repairs. Life continued. Yet one thing had changed. People listened more carefully now. Not because Garrett became famous. Because they learned that appearances often tell the wrong story. Around mid-morning, a young man arrived driving an old pickup truck. He looked nervous. He carried a folder beneath one arm. Mr. Cole. Garrett looked up from an engine. Yeah. Can I ask you something? Garrett smiled. Depends. The young man laughed awkwardly. Everybody thinks I am making a mistake. Garrett immediately understood. They sat at a small table near the office. The young man explained his idea. A neglected property. A forgotten business opportunity. Something nobody else believed in. The details were different. The feeling was familiar. When he finished, Garrett remained quiet for several seconds. Then he asked a simple question. Have you done your homework? Yes. Are you certain? As certain as I can be. Garrett nodded. Then trust the facts more than the noise. The answer seemed to relieve the young man immediately. After he left, Sophie walked into the workshop carrying college textbooks. She had grown into a confident young woman. Yet some things never changed. Another one? She asked. Garrett smiled. Looks that way. People keep showing up. Apparently. Sophie looked toward the framed photograph. I think they are really coming for that story. Garrett glanced toward the image on the wall, then back toward the open garage door. Maybe she was right. Later that year, the racing legend invited Garrett and Sophie to a private museum event celebrating important moments in American motorsports. The restored coupe stood under display lights surrounded by historical exhibits. Visitors admired it. Photographers documented it. Historians discussed its significance. Yet Garrett spent very little time looking at the car. His attention stayed on Sophie as she explored the exhibits with wide eyes. At one point, the legend walked over carrying 2 cups of coffee. You know, he said. People still ask how you knew. Garrett smiled. I did not know. Close enough. No. Garrett shook his head. I paid attention. The legend laughed softly. That might be even rarer. As the evening continued, visitors gathered around the coupe listening to guides explain its history. They talked about engineering innovations, racing programs, lost records, technical achievements. All of it mattered. Yet the final display included something unexpected. A small plaque mounted beside the vehicle. Garrett stopped when he saw it. The inscription was short, simple, easy to miss. Sometimes the greatest discoveries belong to the person willing to look twice. He read the sentence twice, then smiled. Not because it mentioned the car, because it explained something much bigger. On the drive home, Sophie looked out the passenger window while city lights drifted past. Dad, Garrett glanced over. Yeah. If you could go back, would you still buy it? He laughed immediately. For $100? Yes. Garrett smiled toward the road ahead. Every single time. Sophie nodded. The answer never surprised her. Outside, Texas highways stretched beneath the night sky. Inside the truck sat a father and daughter whose lives had changed because one man trusted what he knew when everyone else trusted what they saw. Years earlier, people laughed at a rusted car. They laughed at a single father. They laughed at an idea.